Hello everyone, it's Sam Herbert here. I'm going to give a talk about the photograph as contemporary art. The goal of this talk is to explain to you how photography can be seen within fine art practice as well as painting or sculpture. I've got a few examples of some very notable practitioners to help you understand that and maybe do some further research. And hopefully it will give you some context and opportunity to see the possibility for using photography in your art practice. The first thing I begin with is this rather famous, if apocryphal, quote from Paul Delaroche. I doubt he really said this, but it's one that's resonated since he said it over 180 odd years ago. From today, painting is dead. This was when he saw the first daguerreotype. That was an archaic photograph, like the first photographs that were really commonly invented. So there's always been a sense and a tension between how photography and fine art interact. In fact, there's been a kind of snobbery, particularly in the realm of color photography, that it's always had been a poor relative in relationship to other fine art media. That has changed now. I mean, it's worth looking at the date that 1839, it's a new medium. When one considers painting or sculpture, they're very old media. They've been around for centuries, whereas photography, we've only really got around almost 200 years of history behind it. So it does take a while for these things to sit. But now with video art and moving image, I think photography has become much more established, and it's much more conventional for artists to use that. So let's think about what the reasons are that an artist would use photography as opposed to, say, painting, drawing, or sculpture in their practice. That said, it's not necessary for an artist to be trained as a photographer to use photography. The main difference is to do with the artist's concept and the context within which the work is seen. For example, a photographer will prioritize the technical craft of photography and will always be working towards a set brief. A fine artist using photography will do so for conceptual reasons. They do not necessarily need any training. Just because the results may appear to lack craft, it doesn't mean that they aren't strong artworks. There are also a number of examples of photographers that are also considered fine artists. So the point to take away there is that it doesn't have to be a perfectly crafted photograph for it to have value as an artifact of fine art. It can say something quite powerful in the same way that a painting doesn't have to be rendered in an academic style, say like Michelangelo, for it to have any relevance, that it can be broader than that. If you were a photographer, however, and you're taking blurry, out of focus photos when actually your brief is not to do that, it causes problems for you. So that goes back to the idea of concept and context. Concept is the idea that's guiding the artist, and the context is, well, who wants the work? Who is the work for? The work that I'm illustrating this slide with is August Zander, a very influential German photographer. He was a photographer, but as we'll see later on, his style of photography has influenced and become quite influential in the photographic practices that have come later. And those photographic practices through the late 20th century have become closer and closer related to fine art practice as well. So there is someone that you could research. So let's go through reasons why fine artists use photography. The point at which it really took off and it became a viable and understood method that artists could employ was with conceptual art. This is from the 60s. So since the 60s, artists have used photography rather than painting, drawing, or sculpture to record their work. The conceptual artists were drawn to this due to its ability to convey a clear concept without the baggage of mediums such as painting or sculpture. The photograph also operated as a simple, realistic document of a performance, happening, or intervention. So just to unpick that, that means that the baggage of a medium, well, we understand that in that when you make a painting, when you make a sculpture, there's a great deal of history, and that history can be contentious, and that you tread on, that you're having to always reference the people who've gone before. The interesting thing about photography, particularly in the 60s, was nobody had really used it for art. So actually, it was a very, very open field for artists to work with. It was quite freeing to not feel like, as a painter, you had to refer to Picasso, or as a sculptor, you had to refer to Rodin. Photography was a much more clear and open field to work in. And that goes into the third bullet point there, in that it operates as a document, that it is carrying far less subjective meaning, that it has an objective element to it, that is recording something. Particularly useful if your work was performance based, or it was a happening or an intervention. The artist I'm illustrating here is the British artist John Hilliard. This is called A Camera Recording Its Own Condition, 7 apertures, 10 speeds, 2 mirrors, from 1971, and that was 7 photographs. And here it's very straightforward. What he did was he was just playing with, on a single lens reflex SLR camera, he was simply playing with the setting. So you go from the top corner, which is completely underexposed, to the bottom right corner, which is completely overexposed. So it actually becomes quite an interesting concept. And also visually, it's a very interesting object, that it looks a bit like geometric painting, actually, lots of squares together. So there's some conceptual art. Another artist to talk about is Richard Long. This is an image of a work, and it's called A Line Made by Walking, 1967. Now, Long's work is about walking. So it's the photograph isn't actually the art. The art was the walk he took. Now, there's obvious problems if you want to show that in a gallery, because how can you show someone a walk that you took through Wiltshire or the Lake District? It's very hard to do. So his work is ephemeral and it's site specific. So the photograph was very valuable to him because he was able to document the intervention. So they became stand-ins for the work when it was in an exhibition. So they become artworks in themselves. They certainly have some visual interest as well. I think you could definitely argue that looking at that picture. I mean, the reason there's a line there is he walked over it again and again and again and again and again until he wore the grass out. So you can see that there's a time performative element to that, but it's been recorded at the end of all that. Long isn't present, he's the photographer, and all we have is the residue. So we're left to think about value, we're left to think about the artist, we're left with this document that we are allowed to make our own mind up about what we think about it. So that's Richard Long. Moving on to American artists, Cindy Sherman is an extremely famous contemporary artist. She had a solo show at the National Portrait Gallery not so long ago. This is what she's most famous for, Untitled Film Stills. This one is called Untitled Film Still 27 from 1979. So they're about 40 odd years old now. The Untitled film series used photographs of herself performing the roles of actresses from different types of movies, such as B-movies, art house, and mainstream cinema. Her use of photography subverted and questions how women are depicted in media. She appropriates the look of film stills. So she's not a film star. This wasn't a film. This is her setting up something that looks like a film a still from a film, a promotional picture from a film, but it didn't happen. In all of them, she's playing a different role, and it allows her, like an actress, to adopt these different roles that are assigned to females. And through seeing that, we are asking questions how women are depicted, and the role of women in cinema, also the role of the viewer, the so-called male gaze, the performativity of the camera, and how women feel like they're always being viewed in a certain way. So she's done that extremely successfully. She's a very famous artist, and if you aren't familiar with her work, it's a very good idea to do some research, further research on her, because she's got a very long career working with that. All her work is based around herself and photography. A British artist, Stephen Pippen. This is called a self-portrait made by converting a house into a pinhole camera. 1986, 10 photographs mounted onto wooden panels, and it's very, very big, 396 centimeters by 609 centimeters. So that is the size of a back wall of a house, which you can actually see there that it's the shape of a house. Now, Stephen Pippen is famous for converting unusual objects into pinhole cameras. Pinhole photography, in case you don't know, is a very basic form of photography. It's where you have, usually you do it on a much, much smaller scale than this. You just have a box that doesn't allow light in. You prick a hole in the box, you put some photographic paper at the back of the box, and you point that box at a light source for a long time. You take it into the day and leave it for, say, a minute, and it will expose an image, which is exactly what Pippen did. No lenses were involved in this. It was just using a hole in the front door, and the house was sealed up, so it's completely dark. So he turned a whole house. It was actually a derelict bungalow that was turned into a camera. And he stood in front of the house for an incredible 8 hours. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to see him. So the work becomes a photograph, but it also becomes a record of a performance. Thinking about Richard Long, it's a residue of a feat of endurance that he had to stand there pretty still for 8 hours while he recorded that image. So very interesting artist, and another one that's worth doing some further research on. Jeff Wall is a Canadian photographer. He is one of the most well-known. He's a theorist as well as an artist. So he studied art history at the Courtauld, but for the last 45 years, he's made his name making huge-scale photographs that reference art history quite explicitly. That he takes famous paintings and restages them using photography. Previously, this was done by a very, very particular process that used layering of real photographic images. However, he now uses Adobe Photoshop to layer images digitally. It's a lot easier. The work is shown on light boxes, so they actually come across like history paintings, like very, very large paintings. As you can see, the size of this is 167 cm by 244 cm. This work in particular is interesting because the way he layered different times of an apartment. He invited two people to live in this apartment in Vancouver, and he photographed it gradually over 9 months. The final image that you see here was composited from those photographs. So it isn't a snap of a certain time. It's actually made up of 9 months of taking photos and then putting all the photos together into one. So it looks very casual, like it's just a shot of someone leading an everyday existence in their flat, but it isn't. It's much more composed. It's much more put together. It has a lot in common with history painting, with 19th century painting, in the way that it's been put together, which is obviously what Wall is referencing, and it's what he's famous for referencing. So we move on now, and this is where we refer back to Alexander, the first image I showed you of what's known as deadpan photography. Now, deadpan photography is a title that is applied to many contemporary art photographers. It's very, very important. It's very influential, and it's worth getting your head around what this means. Deadpan photography breaks the commonly accepted rules of photographic composition. It appears devoid of emotion and presents the subject in a cool or detached way. It allows the viewer to ask questions and not be led by the artist's bias or personal idea. So just to quickly go over that, this is two of the most famous people. They are probably the initiators of deadpan photography, Berndt and Hiller Becher, two German photographers. I'll talk a bit more about them in the next slide, and extremely influential. But if you were taking a photograph of a building, this would be the way you were advised never to do it, like this, because it's square on, it's very flat, it hasn't got the composition that you would normally be advised to try and make it dynamic, make it look interesting, but they've plonked it square in the middle. It's straight on. It's not the way that a photographer would advise you to take a photo, or particularly if people were really trying to take a dynamic photo, they would say not to do it like this. So they have sucked that element of the personal idea of leading the viewer too much, and they are presenting these in a very what seems objective way, a very straightforward, flat, there's no better word for it, deadpan way. So they're not trying to lead you to a certain way of thinking about it. They're asking you to bring your own thoughts and ideas to this work. So Berndt and Hiller Becher, they're very, very famous. They were responsible, they taught a lot of the people photographers who have gone on to be identified as the Dusseldorf School from Germany. They are influential as both photographers and artists, that they hold equal influence in both fields. They were photographers, however, their work has more and more frequently been seen as conceptual art rather than pure photography. For that reason, you'll often see their work in major museums of contemporary art around the world rather than just photographic museums. Interestingly, their photographs won the first prize at the Venice Biennale in 1990, but not for photography, it was for sculpture, which seems counterintuitive, but actually looking at these works, what you see then they're always presented in this grid, this field. They're never seen individually. They're always put together in a grid. There is a sculptural quality to how they are dealing with these subjects, that they always choose types of things and they take photos of them in a series of repetition. They're very powerful works that hopefully you'll be exposed to them quite a lot. As you go around museums, it's quite hard not to see them. And I think when you actually see enough of these works, you really do start to see the power that they have as fine art as well as photography. And finally, they are very influential because they're also teachers as well as artists. And their students have gone on to be particularly well regarded, and it's deadpan photography is synonymous with it's more properly called the Dusseldorf School, rather. But generally, people, when you say deadpan photography, you're kind of referring to these people, the Dusseldorf School. So let's talk about some of their students. Most famous is Andrei Gursky. He's an extremely famous artist that his work sells for very, very high prices now. He is a photographer, he trained as a photographer, but he's pretty much exclusively seen as a fine artist who uses photography. He works on very large format photographs. The process that he uses is very technically demanding. If you remember our darkroom at college and those enlargers that you can enlarge a negative, those tiny little 35mm negatives can be enlarged sort of to about 6 inches. Look at the size of this photograph, 153 by 306 centimeters. It's fascinating to think how big his enlarger actually is, because that is a photographic enlargement from a large format negative. So technically, they're quite mysterious. That if you do talk to photographers, it's very hard to get your head around how he actually makes these. I don't know whether he has joined the digital revolution. I imagine he has, but there is the same problem of exposing it. And when you see these in a gallery, the Tate, I believe the Tate holds this work, the Rhine #2. It is extraordinary, the level of detail in the photograph. It's a bit like a billboard photograph. It's very, very powerful. Also, the reason that you see this work as a fine art work is because it's making such clear references to abstract painting, particularly geometric abstract painting, that it's very hard to miss. And the scale of it, I can't express to you how important the scale of it really is, that when you're actually physically present with this work, it feels very, very different when you see it on a small screen. There's another Gursky work there. So again, on a very, very large scale, and so powerful, because the work really does become abstract, doesn't it? But that is a genuine place. That is a genuine hotel in Times Square, New York. It's just been taken on a super large format print. Thomas Struth is another German photographer. He's famous for this series here, where he visits major European museums of fine art, sets his camera up in the galleries, and takes what appears to be very offhand, casual snapshots. And they're always snapshots of people looking at art. Again, extremely large scale, 185 by 229 cm, very, very big, changes everything. When we see it on this sort of small screen scale, it looks a bit like a slightly unsuccessful holiday snap. But when you do see these, you suddenly see that there is a great deal of thought into it. There's a great deal of questioning about how we look at art, that we're looking at people looking at art. So it kind of turns the gaze on us again, and we become very much aware of the act of looking and how we look. So again, another intriguing artist who was taught by the Beches. Moving on from the Düsseldorf school, let's talk a little bit about cameraless photography. You've been exposed to, pun intended, exposed to cameraless photography through photograms. Cameraless photography is used a lot by fine artists that use photographic processes. It's very simple. You don't use a camera, that you just make direct exposures of light onto sensitized surfaces. A cameraless photograph is always unique. There's no negative that you can make prints from. Although I suppose you can make contact prints, but in that sense, it isn't the same as the negative image that you produce. The camera is often seen as being an objective recorder. Cameraless photography is more about capturing sensations or mood. So it has a lot in common with, say, abstract painting. It can be very intuitive. It can be very spontaneous, the way you make these. Different types of cameraless photography are photograms, which you've already been sort of exposed, or you've actually had a go at. Chemograms and luminograms, all of those can be researched further. This is an image by Gary Fabian Miller, who's a British artist. He works with cameraless photography. He works with darkroom processes. So this is technically a type of photogram, but he makes, he creates different templates which the light is exposed through. So I think this may be made by pricking holes in paper. He cuts things through, he uses translucent objects, and then he projects the light through. He also does it on extremely long exposures that often exposures take about 4 hours. So you get these extraordinary, strange, very enigmatic colors and shapes that almost looks like microscopic photography, but it isn't. It's a type of photograph he's worked with there. And finally, I have a work by Susan Durgis, another British photographer. She makes photograms using water, a very interesting process. And again, we can work this in our own darkroom at college, just using the trays of water in the darkroom. But she goes into the natural landscape whilst it's dark, obviously at night, and it's used as her darkroom. She will submerge the photographic paper in a river or a body of water, and the moonlight and a flashlight are used to make an exposure. So obviously photographic moonlight does have an ability to expose it. If the moonlight isn't strong enough, she will use a camera flash, depends what she's doing. But you get these absolutely extraordinary final, they look like landscape photographs, but that is simply a photogram where the photographic paper has been put in the water and the light source is either the moon or a flash. She then covers it very quickly, gets it back to a darkroom, and processes it, and that's what you get from it. So another artist that's some really powerful visual statements that come through that. So with cameraless photography, that is the end of our tour of different fine art practices. There's lots more, but I hope this has given you something to consider. It's some more research that you can do. So any of these artists interest you, do some extra research on them, and you never know, it may be something that you return to in the coming terms or academic years. So it's always useful knowledge. So thank you very much for listening, and I hope you found that useful, and goodbye.